Welcome to Anyhoney.
And the Newt. Today's episode is going to continue our series theme of love and relationships, and starting with the relationships found in NBA basketball. We're looking today at the relationship of players to their organizations, to their teams, and to their management.
A quick question as we get into this conversation, because originally I was thinking about organizations as being like front offices and the ownership, which we've talked a little bit about in the past. And there's one dynamic that I hadn't considered until literally just this second, which was including coaches in that organizational type role. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I was hoping we'd talk about that.
Perfect. In our last episode, when we talked about the player player relations, I actually sort of alluded to this. I might have directly mentioned it. Um, but when we talked about, that positive or negative aspect of the player player relations and them being able to do more for each other or want to do less for each other, I find that it's most tangibilized with the organization through the coach. You get a good coach on a team, and the players want to do everything for that coach. And that relationship has some of the same layers that the player-player relationship has. Friendship, professionalism. But on the flip side, right, if you get a bad coach and the chemistry is just not there, which we dissected, um, then all of that negativity permeates through the culture as well. So it doesn't just happen with the players amongst themselves, it can also happen with the coach, I think.
I'm interested in the fact that maybe some players gel well and see the coach's vision and appreciate the plan, and maybe others don't. So there could be a split on the team among players about what they think about the coach and about their system. Maybe there's a coach that inspires a lot of loyalty from everybody, and then maybe there's a situation like the Bulls when Jim Boylan basically would make them do extra conditioning and punish them with extra practices when they performed poorly, and the players were like, we can't stand this guy. They had their little team meeting and expressed frustration to the organization, like this isn't working for us. So there was a unified front against the coach. So all three of those kind of scenarios, I'm curious, uh, what do you think the impact is, and what can a coach do to foster the best relationships possible?
Yeah, that's interesting because you hear all the time of not just their coaching philosophy, but essentially their philosophy with regards to player management. So you think of like the player coaches like Doc Rivers, who becomes really, I guess I would say he's more than personable with them. He's friends with a lot of them, or at least whatever mentorship type of role he applies to his teams, right? So the players like playing for him, because maybe he gives them a little bit of extra leeway. He expects some things to happen professionally, but when they meet those expectations, then he gives them a lot more. At the same time, you have those like militaristic coaches like Boylan that you mentioned, and I'll break into football a little bit. Tom Coughlin from the New York Giants was this like militaristic style coach where, it's all about the conditioning and it's all about the drills and it's all about the execution. And even if you meet all the expectations, you're just expected to do more. And there's no person there. That person might as well be replaced with a machine and you get the same kind of outcomes. Are there any other coaching ideologies that you can think of that I'm missing?
Well, I don't know if I've thought through all the different types, but I think of like a Steve Kerr kind of coach who really does take on the mentorship kind of role. He identifies what the player's strengths are, but it seems like he's more about engaging particular aspects of the game rather than play calling and not necessarily player management. Like it doesn't seem like he's going to either extreme. It's more of a how can I help you as a player see how this situation could have been handled differently or whatever. So that's one example.
Yeah, I find that the coaches who apply mentorship have the most success. And there's lots of different layers to the mentorship, right? There's like the developmental coaches who focus on the growth of players. There's the coaches who help the players in other aspects, not just on the court, but in the other aspects of their lives. You know, whether it's financially or family or health, that sort of relationship. There's everywhere in between, and these types of mentors, I don't we don't typically hear about them a lot outside of the coaching staff. And I'm going to include assistants and developmental coaches into this as well, because the players certainly do develop relationships with these guys because they're next to them literally every day. Sometimes you hear about it with GMs, but you don't really hear about that very frequently. And I would say very rarely do you hear about these kinds of relationships with the ownership. The only owner I can think of that this would apply to is Mark Cuban,
Mm.
maybe Pat Riley. Oh, he's not an owner though.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was definitely wanting to expand. I'm glad you mentioned the assistant coaches because I definitely think there's a lot of relationship that's there and mentorship. Like you're spending a lot of time maybe with the bigs or with players developing a particular talent. Also the training staff and all of the people involved with that. They spend a lot of time with these players, getting to know their personal regimen and trying to help them improve individually, as well as bringing the team together. And so these players have to be developing all kinds of pretty close ties and relationships while they're with an organization. And so one of the curious things is in our very first episode ever, we talked about the NBA as a business and the fact that players can get traded on at any time. Or now that with player empowerment, we talk about free agency. So how do these relationships with trainers, staff, coaches, other players, and this transience of moving from organization to organization. What's the interplay between those two things?
That's really interesting. The thing that I think about is I feel like there's this barrier that players can put up or that coaches can kind of assume, which is that while we are part of management and the organization, right, we're not the ones who trade you. And so whether we're here to help you grow and learn and get into the system and win. But when the trading happens, that's on those guys over there. So I feel like the players can get closer, or at least mentally can allow themselves to get closer to the coaching staff than they might the GMs or the president of basketball operations, the upper management kind of stuff. And maybe they do get to know them. I can think of a couple of instances, but ownership too. But I feel like maybe it's just a perception because because those trades happen, and you sort of have to like maybe actually honestly maybe the players are really in tune with this and they understand that these are people who run the business. So I'm going to have professional relationships with them all, and I can become more than professional friends, work buddies with all these people. But at the same time, like you said, the NBA is a business. So if I get traded, maybe they all understand it's no hard feelings, but there are definitely instances where there are, in fact, hard feelings.
Yeah, let's talk to Isaiah Thomas about that. Um, yeah, no, I think also we have to distinguish between different tiers of players, unfortunately, because in this day and age of player empowerment, you hear frequently like, did management consult the superstars on this team about whether they were okay with this move? Like, they're looking out to go get a free agent or to draft a rookie or to offer an extension. And they consulted the superstars. Well, they're not consulting the 10th, 11th, 12th guy on the bench, right? Like they only really care about their franchise players. And if they're on the out and outs with those franchise players, maybe they won't even consult them then. But so there's probably personal relationships that happen for some of the higher tier players with organizational management? Like that probably does happen. And how does that impact and influence their relationship with other players that don't have that relationship and maybe feel like they have less of a say? How does that impact their relationship with the coaches, since maybe what they tell management can undermine a coach's strategy or game plan? So I'll leave that, toss that out to you, and then I have some other thoughts about the other tier of players.
Yeah, real quick, we saw that happen this past summer with the Rockets, right? Um, when Daryl Morey left and he went to the Sixers, I mean, basically the floodgates opened and all this information came out that the Rockets were treating Harden with gold gloves, silk gloves, I should say. I guess that's the phrase, and doing whatever it was that he wanted. And it sounded like Daryl Morey had a really good relationship with Harden. I'm not sure what the extent of it is, but enough so that he's trying to trade for him to bring him to the Sixers as we speak. So there is that layer of, elevating the relationship beyond professionalism. And maybe Morey just thinks the world of Harden's game style. And at the same time, as soon as Morey left, the Rockets took the gloves off and they're like, we're not doing anything you say from here on out. You got to report to the team. You're not allowed to just party all night in Vegas. You're going to play and we're going to trade you when we trade you.
Yeah. So I'm just curious how that. I mean, obviously, we're seeing how it plays in Houston, but that also seems like that was a mess to begin with. I wonder in other situations, Minnesota. That seems like a good place to, as an example, right? You've got Carl Anthony Towns, and it's not really clear what his relationship is with management. I would imagine that the market that they're in and how difficult it is for them to attract free agents, they're doing everything they can to keep him there, including team construction and contracts and that kind of stuff. So, what do they do to foster that relationship? Is it merely professional consultation, or do they have to do the wine and dine, or maybe just because that they've had many interactions with him, do they develop a relationship?
I'm glad you brought up the Timberwolves, which I hadn't thought of. And just dialing back the clock a little bit, you just go before Towns, right? His predecessor, Kevin Garnett. Well, I guess his predecessor was Kevin Love, but the predecessor before that, the other Kevin, Kevin Garnett, he had this one aspect about him that I think won him favor. And you read interviews about Kevin Garnett now, and he talks about how much he loves the Wolves ownership, how much he loves the front office there, how much he loves the city. And I think that that one thing is this concept of loyalty. It's kind of like the opposite, essentially, of the NBA as a business, where people can get traded all willy nilly. I think when a team sees that a player has this loyalty to them, they maybe want to invest a little more into that. Now, as soon as I think we've seen this more often than not. As soon as there's some chink in that armor, they toss them aside as quickly as possible in that trade thing. But I think that we're starting to see these dynamics that you're referring to here.
I wonder if that's. I just wonder if we can generalize across all the teams in the NBA. I feel like we saw in Dallas, Mark Cuban and Dirk Nowitzki had this amazing relationship, and Dirk wanted to stay with Dallas, and Dallas wanted to make Dirk happy, and it seemed mutual. It didn't seem like one of them bribed the other or held the other, extorted the other.
Hmm.
But then you've got like Danny Ainge in Boston, who doesn't care where you're at on the team. Like if I find a deal that's advantageous for me, goodbye. Um, and we saw that when he got rid of the Garnett and Paul Pierce to the Brooklyn Nets.
Oh, my interpretation of that was it was like a mutual decision.
I have heard that they kind of came along to like understand the benefits of that trade for them as well. But I mean, I think Paul Pierce had this real strong loyalty. I mean, he was there before the big three, and I think envisioned finishing his career out in Boston.
Well, I know that he had the strong loyalty of being in Boston, but I thought that because I remember there being rumors of Garnett and Pierce wanting to play for the Nets, and then Ainge made that trade happen and got literally everything out of that trade. Um, but at the same time, there's instances like you said of players being traded even when there's loyalty involved, and I think it makes it harder. But there's only a few instances of those loyalty ties being so thick, and then I'm gonna say that management's the one that breaks the trust in that loyalty connection. A few instances of that trust. I think of Isaiah Thomas with the Celtics, not the Isaiah Thomas, the little Isaiah Thomas, with the Celtics as that one thing. Um, LeBron was the trust breaker in that loyalty of the Cavs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does happen in both directions. Probably it has traditionally been more management's decision to make, and so loyalty has only ever felt one directional until recent years. So I think I'm glad it's becoming more equal. I want to go back to something you said earlier because I've been thinking about this. You mentioned about how the players get to know the trainers and the coaches and assistants and everything, and they see management as up there the business interests and the business is their decision. But I wonder if that's true, especially for the lower tier players where they don't have as much sway with the organization and the game isn't being built around them. Like, I wonder if there's any uh, if they hold coaches. When I say accountable, it's not like they can do anything about it, but if they resent or blame coaches for not giving them enough playing time or using them in a way that doesn't they don't think is their best way to be used, right? Like, you're hurting my career, you're hurting my money making opportunities. I'm curious about how those game planning strategies and decisions affect the interpersonal relationships.
I remember Larry Brown when he was with the Knicks. He's a really interesting case because just the very year before, he had Eastern Conference Finals. Actually, I think they won the championship the year before he went to the Knicks with the Pistons. And those players talked about doing anything for Larry Brown because, obviously he got them to the promised land, but, they had really great team chemistry, and it seemed like everybody, the coaching staff and the players, were all in harmony. He goes to the Knicks, and it's like a total disaster. And
Hmm.
players talking about not having consistent rotations, the things that they're being told to do. Channing Frye actually just did an interview on this like a month ago, where he was like he got drafted because he was a jumpsuiting power forward center, and he goes out and he has like a 30-point game, and the very next day Larry Brown comes to him and he says like don't shoot those jumpers, turn your back to the basket and back a guy down. And Channing Frye's like, that's not my game at all. And all of his teammates are like, he just scored 30 playing his game, why are you forcing him to do something he's not capable of right now?
I don't have any like solid examples, but I was thinking about the way that Eric Bledsoe was used with the Clippers and then the Suns and then the Bucks and like the different roles that he's played and how much of a say he felt he had. Like, especially when he was on the Phoenix Suns and they had like three starting quality point guards,
Mm-hmm.
Goran Dragic and Isaiah Thomas and him. And I can't remember who they had a fourth point guard. Like, it was ridiculous how many people they had in one spot. Um, or something like I was hearing about Sadaransky when he was playing with the Wizards, how Scott Brooks refused to play a 6'7" guy at the point guard, even though that was a position he had grown up playing and played in college or whatever, or I guess in Europe. And now he's with Chicago and he's like performing way better because he's finally going back to a position he's familiar with. Whereas Scott Brooks is like, you're 6'7", you're there for a wing. We're going to play you wing style. We're going to play traditional. And I wonder if Sadaransky hadn't spent, I think it's 4 years, 3 or 4 years with the Wizards, kind of stagnating in a position that wasn't his fit. Um, could he have had a different career? Could he be a sought after? I mean, nowadays a 6'7" point guard is starting to become the norm.
Right.
So he could have been on that front edge of that, and now instead he's like a backup player or whatever.
Right. Yeah, you talk about um, decision making we've talked about decision making amongst the players on the court all the time, but there's decisions that have to be made, from the GM's perspective, who to trade, who not to trade, from the coaches, who to play, who not to play, and in what situations you play them, and the players, right? We've talked about those decisions all the time. And but we've never talked about how detrimental a bad decision could be. And we've talked about these different layers with the GMs and with the coaching staff, right? You pick the wrong player to trade, you destroy the chemistry of the team. Maybe somebody was like especially loved in the locker room. Now they're gone and everyone's like crushed. And maybe that was just a kind of a superficial feeling, but that being defeated because you really love that guy and everybody loved that guy, that has like real effects. It looked like you were going to say something.
Well, all I was going to say is I can't remember the example. I actually heard that a week ago, where somebody, a veteran who was a bench player and didn't spend a lot of time on the floor, but when he got traded to try and make some salary stuff work out in another trade, the team said that was he was our core. Like, you just took our heart away from us, and they performed much worse without him. So yeah, there is an actual example of what you were just saying. I just can't remember what player it was. I want to take a moment to just kind of pull out a little bit and say we've spent several episodes now talking about basketball and relationships and love of the game, chemistry with other players, relationships with coaches as mentors or with the organization. I really want to kind of set the stage for the rest of the season of our podcast and talking about like relationships. There are a lot of different complex relations that we may not be able to spell out all the factors and components of, right? But we've identified several principles. I think it'll be interesting to just explore how they apply in society at large. So things like loyalty. What do we mean by loyalty? Is loyalty a good thing? Things like chemistry and camaraderie. Do those help pursue practical projects and social functions, or is that merely like an aesthetic? I'm pleased to have that kind of camaraderie with other people, and other kinds of relationships. So I just wanted to kind of pull back and use some of the things that we've talked about in these past few episodes to set the stage for relationships.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Luckily, most of us don't have to worry about being traded from our day job. But that's not to say that these decisions that affect, your work life or your home life, they don't have at least analogous sorts of impacts, right? And one of the reasons why I found um, basketball, this conversation about basketball so compelling was when you think about it beyond just like, that these are guys playing a game or women playing a game, that these same things, this is what why I started getting interested in basketball in the first place. So these same things happen in our own personal lives, right? The players have friends, they have their friends, they have their family, they have the friendships that they have on the court, right? And all of those things are relationships. And relationships can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think it's just really interesting the dynamics that you can have with all of these different relationships.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about these teams as miniature societies or communities, and maybe the analogy doesn't fit real, tightly, but we can see or explore kind of questions of collective decision making or responding to hierarchies in society and things like that by looking at team dynamics, and then also to think about the NBA as a league and as an institution. So how do players interact with players from other teams, and how do managers relate with one another and relate to the fans, the as customers or as proponents of their cause. Like, all these kinds of relationships I think open up interesting questions about how we relate to our local neighborhood, to maybe a larger impersonal infrastructure like government or um, capitalism, whatever structure you want to talk about, versus also the interpersonal, like the people that I live with or my family members, right? So there are a lot of different dynamics at a lot of different levels.
Yeah, one thing that I want to bring up before we wrap this up is, and this applies in a lot of different senses, is one thing that I've kind of been learning is that the key to successful relationships is remembering that those things, those relationships are dependent on people, right? And a lot of times we kind of get into our own heads, and when we start thinking about the other thing on the end of the relationship as more of an asset. I think of with the players, right? The NBA is a business. Basically what happens there is like the players get traded and the media portrays them as just assets to the team, which tells one story, and the players may buy into that, right? But I think that the coaches and the GMs and the players who are most successful, they understand that they're not just assets or that they're not just tools for the job, but that they are people. And going back to that Channing Frye interview, I remember he told this one part about Isaiah Thomas, the Isaiah Thomas, not little one, coming to him and saying, "Hey, you're being traded to the Blazers, and I really think that Nate McMillan is going to be a great coach for you." And he basically sat there and like listed all the reasons why Nate McMillan was gonna be helpful. And I think like despite all of Isaiah Thomas's flaws, he understood that here's a really young man, um, probably devastated that he's getting traded from the team, probably feels betrayed, and he's essentially saying like, you did great for us and we really appreciated what you did here, and now you're going to be able to take the next step in your career because we're giving this to you. So it's more of a, not just the transaction, but that transaction is a relationship, and also, me and you are people, and we have this relationship too, and I'm not trying to portray
Hmm. A really masterful breakup.
that. Yes, exactly. Perfected it.
Yeah, no, that's good. So we'll explore some of these themes in future episodes. I think we've got some exciting stuff on the horizon. We're talking about doing some guest interviews and bringing some other perspectives into these questions and conversations. So
Finally.
stay. Yeah, yeah, we're tired of hearing those two guys talk. Uh, so stay tuned.